This is a video about deciding and changing your mind. John Milton was in his 20s when he wrote the companion poems L'Allegro and Il Penseroso. They're contrasting views of the good life. L'Allegro, the cheerful man or the extrovert, is sociable and fun-loving. Il Penseroso, the contemplative man or the introvert, is thoughtful, meditative. Both poems begin with classical mythology to personify mirth and melancholy. Both move on to narratives of daily life, including, in L'Allegro's case, farming, a hunt, eating, dancing and taking in a show. For Il Penseroso, it's walking, thinking, listening, studying. In some ways, L'Allegro and Il Penseroso contrast. In others, they're complementary. Each takes digs at the other, but they both enjoy nature, stories, drama, in the one case comedy, in the other tragedy. Milton doesn't offer a verdict on which of the two ways of life is better, but he shows us benefits of both, embedding them in bucolic scenery. Written about 1631, L'Allegro and Il Penseroso were published in 1645, became popular, and stayed popular. 100 years later, at the suggestion of philosopher James Harris, George Frederick Handel set them to music. In deciding what to use and how to interleave the two perspectives, Handel was helped by Edward Jennens, a regular collaborator who shortly after would select the texts for Messiah, Handel's great oratorio. When I first fell for the Messiah, I used to enthuse about how Handel completed the music so quickly, evidence of almost divine inspiration. The truth is more or less the opposite. Handel always composed fast, but he took longer over Messiah than over L'Allegro. 3 weeks for Messiah, 2 weeks for L'Allegro. Even so, Jennens thought Handel rushed the Messiah job. He could have been better, Jennens thought, if only Handel would slow down and think about the words a bit. Back to L'Allegro. 1740. Handel, Harris and Jennens felt the implicit question of Milton's paired poems needed an answer. Which way of life is better? The answer, this being the 18th century, was neither extreme but a middle way, il moderato. So Jennens wrote words for the sensible, balanced follower of the middle way, and that became the conclusion of the work. Extroversion and introversion reconciled by the voice of steady reason, and, as Jennens butchered a quote from Shakespeare to say, restoring intellectual day. Handel was initially very keen on the il moderato concept, and after the first performances were criticised because Moderato's words weren't up to the Milton standard, Handel did his best to reassure Jennens. But Handel was a showman. What counted was what worked with the audience, and a few performances showed that il moderato didn't. So when he revived L'Allegro il Penseroso e Moderato in 1743, there was no il moderato. Handel scrubbed not only the whole third part, but also scrambled the end of part 2 to finish on an upbeat note with L'Allegro, rather than a pensive final thought from Il Penseroso. When you map Handel's changes back onto Milton, you see he mangled the arguments of the original poems. Given Handel's respect for the poetry and his insistence on the middle way solution of il moderato originally, it's remarkable how readily he tore up the logic for the revivals. He changed his mind. It wasn't a wobble. Handel was not indecisive. He decided one way and acted, then changed his mind, decided the other way and acted again, decisively. Despite the damage to Milton's words, Handel's later version was surely more faithful to Milton's intention. The poet wanted to lay out the two types of life for consideration, exploration, to compare and contrast. He didn't want a verdict, least of all a compromise. More than that, Milton's poems are invocations. While the speaker's disposition, personality or humour might be inclined one way or the other, let's say to the extrovert or introvert, after the initial prejudiced rejections of the other side, both poems begin by calling on divine help to be more extrovert or more introvert. Milton seems to know he and his readers could trigger both sides. You may have an innate disposition, but also a choice of the will to indulge that disposition or to experiment with the opposite. Handel's later versions respect Milton's perspective. They celebrate the alternatives. That's not only truer to Milton, but truer to Handel as well. He composed lightly for l'allegro and with depth for il penseroso. He liked doing both. Performers, singers of Handel's work or dancers of Mark Morris's work take on both perspectives. The last thing they need is to be rebuked by an il moderato for their extremes of exploration. Handel's revisions left later performers with a quandary. Which version? For most pieces in the classical repertoire, the answer is straightforward. You perform the composer's settled, finished work. F. Shoshani has built his career on discovering Bach's final position for the well-tempered clavier. Hardly anyone performs the first version of Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet, and so on. Yet, when it's performed, the usual thing is to do l'allegro, il penseroso et il moderato from 1740, rather than l'allegro et il penseroso from 1743. As an indicator of how prevalent this is, here's the first page of responses to a search on Amazon. Apart from a rather sexy out-of-place simile, all but one are for the full 3 parts. The exception is this Wilcox version with Peter Pears. Why? Do we now feel, again, that extroversion and introversion need to be resolved with a middle way? No. Within the relatively unexciting music of Part 3, there is one undisputed gem, the duet, as steals the morn. Within Handel, Harris and Jennens' original concept, as steals the morn is pivotal. L'allegro solos have been sung by men, 3 soloists assigned different songs, their plurality symbolising the sociability of l'allegro. Il penseroso solos have been sung by 1 woman, symbolising solitude. Il Moderato himself is sung by a different male voice until, near the end of the whole piece, one of the l'allegro singers joins with the Il Penseroso singer in this duet, symbolising reconciliation of the 2 perspectives, or, given Jennens' words, submission of both sides to the Il Moderato perspective. Handel ditched As Steals the Morn along with the rest of Il Moderato, changing his mind to see that Milton's words don't need resolution and especially don't need resolving into a middle way, but the world feels differently. As Steals the Morn is the hit you can't omit. On YouTube, this performance has racked up 4.2 million views. There are many other versions of just this single duet, and even a page getting people to vote on their favourite. What to do? Mark Morris solved this by taking Handel's later approach, ditching most of Il Moderato and ending with joyous l'allegro, but snuck in As Steals the Morn, where he hoped no one would notice that the words don't fit. In his memoir out loud, he says, "I reimagined it so that no one watching would imagine the words were from an argument for moderation." Morris's approach is like Handel's. He wants what works best in performance, not a philosophical message or logical consistency. Another possibility might be to change the words of As Steals the Morn, not the Shakespearean quote, but Jennens' additions to make it fit better. Not perfectly, because the whole premise of a duet between Allegro and Il Moderato would still stand out, but acceptably. Historically informed performances should cut Il Moderato. Just stop doing it. I'm not calling for a ban on Part 3, that would be very un-Miltonian. But let's face it, Il Moderato wasn't just a musical and lyrical mistake, it was an insult to Milton. Sure, L'Allegro and Il Penseroso were relative trifles compared to Milton's later works like Paradise Lost. They were written when he was young, before his grand tour, where he met the blind imprisoned Galileo, a scene echoed in his own loss of liberty and blindness years later. They were before his political life in Cromwell's Republic and the backlash to that. They might almost have been exercises such as he'd done at Cambridge in oppositional thinking, but they're consistent with the great themes of Milton's life: individual thought, the richness of alternatives, the ability to imagine and explore, the freedom to change your mind. In Paradise Lost, it's Adam and Eve's choice to eat the apple, individual freedom. In Areopagitica, the foundational text of freedom of the press, we read, God, though he command us temperance, justice, continence, yet pours out before us, even to a profuseness, all desirable things, and gives us minds that can wander beyond all limit and satiety. Why should we then affect a rigour contrary to the manner of God and of nature by abridging or scanting those means? Milton wasn't always consistent. He wasn't very tolerant of Catholics, for example. Although his tracts and speeches in favour of easy divorce fit with the philosophical concept of the right to change your mind, they were probably more the result of him not getting on with his wife. But in his art, he was an Enlightenment prophet. Milton's less poetic successors, like John Stuart Mill, developed the theme that being allowed to express all ideas is the way to truth. They elevated the liberty of the individual and solidified the right to change your mind. Debates today about religion and culture tend to emphasise balancing the public goods of toleration, safety and liberty. But the private right to change your mind and then say so is one of the most important freedoms. In art, that gift calls for dialectic, not someone preaching the decision, or l'allegro and il penseroso, but not il moderato. In life, that gift stands unequivocally against any ideology that promises dire penalties for changing your mind. In the end, Milton was well served by Handel, because Handel was an explorer, a radical originator, and a great mind changer.